June 6, 1944. As dawn broke over the coast of Normandy, a 32-year-old German naval officer named Walter Ohmsen stood atop the reinforced concrete observation post of the Crisbecq Battery. He raised his binoculars and scanned the horizon. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The English Channel, once a natural moat guarding Hitler's fortress Europe, had transformed into a highway of steel. Ships stretched from horizon to horizon, their dark silhouettes merging into one vast, moving wall. It wasn't a raid. It wasn't a feint. It was the real thing, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Ohmsen watched as nearly 7,000 vessels advanced toward the French coast. The Allied fleet included over 1,200 warships, 4,000 landing craft, and nearly 200,000 naval personnel from 8 different countries. At 5:52 a.m., Ohmsen's battery received the order to fire. 3 minutes later, massive shells from Checkmate 210mm cannons arced toward the invasion force. He struck the destroyer USS Corrie, the only U.S. destroyer lost on D-Day. But the rest kept coming. An unstoppable tide of steel, men, and machines. It was like throwing stones at a tsunami. The Allied fleet unleashed a storm. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers began a calculated bombardment. The USS Texas alone fired 255 massive shells in the first hour, more high explosives than some entire German artillery regiments had in reserve. By mid-morning, the Allied naval forces had fired over 130,000 tons of explosive ordnance. And this was only the beginning. At 6 a.m., the second phase of the assault began, not from the sea but from the sky. Allied aircraft filled the air. More than 14,000 sorties launched in a single day. The Luftwaffe could only manage a few hundred. For every German aircraft, there were 46 Allied planes in the sky. At Omaha Beach, the slaughter was intense. The 352nd Infantry Division had excellent defensive positions. Machine guns opened fire as the first American waves hit the shore. Young soldiers like Heinrich Sue, a 20-year-old manning an MG-42, fired over 12,000 rounds. He later described the sea as covered with bodies, the surf turning red with blood. For a brief moment, it seemed the Atlantic wall might hold. But then the American destroyers did something unthinkable. They moved in close. Risking grounding or mines, they closed to within 1,000 yards of the beach. Their guns turned individual German bunkers into rubble. Ships were no longer precious assets. They were tools, and America had thousands more. The German defenders were not just facing a larger army. They were facing a different kind of war, a war of factories, fuel, steel, and mass production. Landing craft continued to arrive without pause. Tank-carrying LCTs delivered 30-ton Shermans directly onto the sand. Amphibious trucks swam ashore and drove inland to deliver supplies. By nightfall, over 156,000 Allied troops were on French soil. They brought with them more tanks than the German 7th Army had in the entire region. In one day, the Allies landed 20,000 vehicles, 1,700 tanks, and 15,000 tons of supplies. And then came the impossible. The Allies began building their own harbors. German reconnaissance flights returned with photographs that senior commanders refused to believe. The Allies weren't capturing ports, they were constructing them from scratch. The Mulberry harbors, massive prefabricated ports, were assembled off the coast using 600,000 tons of concrete and dozens of sunken ships. Within 2 weeks, they were offloading 9,000 tons of supplies daily, more than many major French ports. By now, German commanders were beginning to understand the full scale of their miscalculation. They had prepared for a traditional invasion, but what they faced was an industrial avalanche. Operation Fortitude had completely deceived German intelligence, keeping key panzer divisions frozen in reserve while Normandy burned. Even when the 21st Panzer Division was finally sent forward, it was destroyed en route, stalled by airstrikes, naval fire, and logistical chaos. When it reached the front near Sword Beach, It encountered the HMS Warspite firing 15-inch shells from 15 miles offshore, capable of annihilating any tank ever built. In July, as the Allies prepared to break out of Normandy, Operation Cobra delivered the final proof of Allied dominance. Over 2,400 bombers unleashed 3,300 tons of bombs on a narrow corridor of German resistance. One German division commander reported, "We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an industrial complex." Panzer Lehr, one of the most feared German formations, simply ceased to exist. Survivors were either dead, wounded, or psychologically shattered. The scale of destruction was incomprehensible. Friendly fire killed over 100 American troops, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking U.S. officer killed in Europe. Yet even that loss didn't stop the offensive. The final chapter came at the Falaise Pocket in August. Trapped and surrounded, German forces were crushed. Estimates put German losses at up to 15,000 dead and over 50,000 captured. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, and over 250 artillery pieces were lost. The German military wasn't just defeated, it was dismantled. In the aftermath, German officers struggled to grasp what had happened. They had prepared to fight soldiers. Instead, they were buried by industry. The production numbers told the story. In 1944, Germany produced roughly 40,000 aircraft. The U.S. produced 96,000. Germany made 29,000 tanks. America and its allies made more than 3 times that. The U.S. produced over 650,000 military trucks, Germany, just 68,000. Allied wartime production included 297,000 aircraft, nearly 200,000 artillery pieces, and over 2 million army trucks. In sheer quantity, Germany never stood a chance. And the technology gap was just as vast. American radar-directed naval guns could hit targets miles inland with pinpoint accuracy. Proximity fuses made anti-aircraft fire deadly. Amphibious trucks like the WWII solved logistical problems the Germans couldn't even conceive of. The Allies had specialized vehicles for every battlefield need: mine clearers, bridge layers, bunker busters. German officers described a specific dread of naval gunfire. Ships like the HMS Rodney and USS Texas were mobile artillery platforms with firepower far beyond anything the Germans could match. By July, daylight movement became suicidal for German forces. Allied aircraft patrolled the skies relentlessly, able to respond within minutes to any enemy activity. The numbers were overwhelming. 12,000 Allied aircraft in theater, flying up to 8,000 sorties per day. The Luftwaffe? On some days, it managed fewer than 100. The final tally from the Normandy campaign was clear. Over 250,000 Allied troops landed, nearly 500,000 vehicles brought ashore, and 400,000 tons of supplies delivered. German losses included 240,000 killed, 200,000 captured, and over 2,000 tanks and guns destroyed. More than 40 divisions were shattered beyond repair. 10 years later, in 1954, surviving German officers gathered in Bonn to reflect on what they had witnessed. General Gunther Blumentritt gave the keynote address. He said, "We learned in Normandy that war had changed fundamentally. It was no longer a contest of armies but of economic systems. We counted divisions. They counted factories." The image that stayed with him, haunting even in memory, was of American bulldozers pushing aside destroyed German tanks to make way for supply trucks. By the end of the war, many of these officers would go on to help build NATO and support European integration, realizing that only by pooling resources could the continent ever match American capacity. Even German generals who had fought in Italy noted the difference. In Italy, they fought soldiers. In Normandy, they faced the full weight of Allied industry and were erased. On June 6, 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Walter Ohmsen returned to the same observation post where he had first seen the Allied fleet. Now an old man, he looked out once again across the sea and said, "I knew in that moment everything I had been told was wrong. Weak nations don't build 7,000 ships. Divided nations don't coordinate such an invasion. He had fired his guns at the approaching armada, but for every ship he hit, 100 passed untouched. His final reflection: in modern war, the side that can produce the most wins. That morning in 1944, German officers watching the channel weren't just witnessing an invasion. They were witnessing a new era of warfare. Industrial warfare. War where steel, oil, and factories mattered more than tactics or courage. Their defeat wasn't military, it was mathematical. Not tactical, but industrial. Not a failure of will, but a shortage of trucks. The lesson of D-Day was written in steel across the English Channel. When the factories of democracy go to war, nothing can stand in their way.